Presentation that we're going to have today from Professor Ian MacMillan from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Business. You know, it's been a pleasure to get to know Mac, as he prefers to be called. He's the Ambani Professor of Entrepreneurial Management at the Wharton School. And I was just talking with our good friend Dave Patel, who's just returned home from India, with some of our MBA students and MSHR students who went there over the spring break. And he said he happened to see the home of the son of Mr. Ambani, which is a 24 or 27-story skyscraper in Mumbai. The Ambanis have been an amazing family of entrepreneurial success, and I'm really glad that they saw fit to endow a professorship at Wharton so that our friend and colleague Ian MacMillan could occupy that chair and be here with us today. Some of you may not be fully aware of how distinguished his record of achievement is. He is clearly one of the brightest minds in the whole area of entrepreneurship and has helped prepare and develop that field. He's had best-selling books on corporate venturing and the entrepreneurial mindset, and he's published in journals like the Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management Review. His consulting help is sought out by major corporations around the world, and here in the United States, Microsoft, DuPont, General Electric, Citibank, Texas Instruments, and so forth. He is now the director of the academic director of the Saul C. Snider Entrepreneurial Center at Wharton. This is a center that works around the world to advance understanding of entrepreneurship and global wealth creation. And he's done much of his work with the Wharton Societal Wealth Program, which is focused on helping to create businesses where there are market failures that attack social problems in a way that help people become self-sufficient rather than dependent. We had hoped that Professor MacMillan would be able to bring his wife with him. This is the 49th of 50 states that he has visited in the United States, so only one is left for him to visit. His wife was unfortunately not able to make the journey with him this time, which gives us the opportunity to invite him back another time. So we're really delighted about that. Mac, thank you so much for coming. Won't you join me in welcoming Professor Ian MacMillan?
Thank you very much. So, testing. Can you hear at the back? You turn it up a bit so that the people at the back, okay. If you can't hear, then go like this, and I'll try and speak louder. We have a couple of problems with me presenting. Firstly, I have a relatively soft voice, and I mumble. So if I start hearing at the back, stop mumbling, then I'll try to stop mumbling. And then the second problem, which is a little bit less sort of tractable with technology, is that I speak funny. I've got a weird accent. And I've been in this country since 1976, but I can't shake my accent. I'm basically African. My mother was a Kenyan. Her mother was a Kenyan. My father was a Zambian. And so, you know, we are multi-generational Africans. And I know I don't look it, but I actually am an African. And I started life, I want to give you a bit of a background about who's this bozo standing talking to you. I started life in the South African gold mines, my working career, working on a mine called Western Deep Levels, and it's not called Deep Levels for nothing. When I was working on it, they were down to 12,000 feet below ground level, which is like 2 3/4 miles straight down. They're now down to about 16,000 feet. This was not exactly a fun job. But the reason I went there was so that I could get a scholarship to go to college. And so I went to college and in South Africa and got a degree in chemical engineering. My first job out of my alma mater, which was University of Witwatersrand, I manufactured nitroglycerin, which is a product where you do not encourage workforce participation with the process. People must do exactly what they're told. And that was a pretty crummy job as well. And so, because you get a headache when you're working with nitro constantly, and it's kind of dangerous. So I went on and I made super saturated nitric acid, which you use to pump into the afterburners of Mirage jets so that they get that extra kick of oxygen that's needed to really get the jet going. And then I made supersaturated sulfuric acid. And then I went to the South African Atomic Energy Board, where we were in this program that eventually developed the South African atomic bomb. And we had nuclear capability in the late 70s, early 90s, early 80s. But there I manufactured uranium hexafluoride, which is the gas that you use to separate out the isotopes. And once you've got your isotopes separated out, you can use your unstable isotope to make nuclear capability. Now the nice thing about that is that uranium hexafluoride is highly corrosive, poisonous, and radioactive. And so if you see me in the dark, I glow a faint green color. So once again, I didn't like that job very much. And so I left and went to build a refinery in Durban, an oil refinery in Durban, which is one of the ports on the east coast of South Africa. And I got tired of this. I got tired of coming to work every day and having to work very hard. So I said, if I'm going to work very hard, I may as well be an entrepreneur. So I ended up being an entrepreneur. We started a travel business that went international, specializing in tours that other people didn't want to take. You know, our segment, our market segment, were the dumb rich, and that's a great segment to serve. Because you can tailor your product in such a way that if these people like it, you can make a lot of margin. So we went global. We went almost global with that. In those days, we didn't say global. We said international. Now everybody's global. It used to be international. And we sold that business off to a big company that was too stupid to innovate. And now I had a real problem, is that I had a fair amount of money and nothing to do. So I looked around for a job where I didn't have to come to work every day. And lo and behold, I found academia. So I got offered a job at the University of South Africa, and the advantage of the University of South Africa at that stage, the whites were in control of the government. It was the only university where we were allowed to teach black people with white people. The rest of the system, you had, really good white universities and very poor black universities, because the government wasn't interested in training and educating black people. They were supposed to work. They weren't supposed to think. So it was, a pretty crummy situation, and this was the only place that taught like that, so I joined them. And then I got invited to teach at Northwestern, and then I taught at Columbia, and then I taught at NYU, and then Wharton came to me one day and they said, how would you like a tenured position at Wharton? I didn't understand what tenure was. So they said, it means that, you get a job for life. And, we can't fire you. I said, wow, this sounds like a great job to me. So I said, I'll have that. And I said, this is the problem though. If you work for us, you have to work a 6-hour week. And because we understand why you have to work so hard, we'll give you 4 months vacation a year. So baby, look at this, man. I got a job for life. I don't ever have to be right again. I work a 6-hour week, and I get 4 months vacation a year. I mean, you've got to be kidding. I took that job in a heartbeat. And I joined them in 1986. And I've regretted it since 1986, but, that's not my problem. And so, you know, what I'm actually able to do, which is what is so delightful about my situation, is I can now go around the world and study people, you know, like yourselves or yourselves in 10, 15 years' time, and look at the way in which you tackle messy, intractable, nasty problems, and begin to kind of do research, looking at how might we begin to attend to those problems. And then every now and then I'm lucky enough to get invited by people like Doug to come and share what I've been doing in my research world with people like yourselves. And you know, what I like to do is I like to get a chance to sort of say, well, here's the stuff that I'm finding that you might find useful, and let's see if it is useful. But there's just no question that my fairly general theory will not specifically and snugly fit your situation. You know, everybody's going to have their own markets, their own technologies, their own new business ideas, and it's going to differ from, you know, from person to person. And so what we really need to do is think a bit about what I'm sharing with you, because I come in the spirit of sharing with you, not selling. I have nothing to sell. So this is some stuff I think you might find useful. And if you really don't find it useful, then let me know. You know, put up your hand and say, hey, this doesn't work for me. Because if you disagree with me, that's okay. I got tenure. And the only danger is that maybe Doug won't invite me back again. So you know, really, I see these as opportunities to share with you some of the findings that we have. And the particular problem that we've been experiencing and working with for some time is this one. And that is, it's like many entrepreneurs. I see an investment opportunity that has just unbelievable high potential, but it's really uncertain. And how do I begin to think about, can I take that forward? And much of what I'm going to be talking about here captures the essence of how, when you work with entrepreneurs and you look at the way that they think and you look at the way that they make decisions, they sort of intuitively do this, the way that they look at uncertain situations. And unfortunately, large companies don't seem to have that capacity. So what I do is spend a lot of time talking to big companies that are basically too stupid to innovate about, you know, how you want to think as an entrepreneur. And so let's spend a bit of time talking about this problem and see whether there are places where you disagree with me, because the way that I learn is when I do a presentation and somebody has a really powerful and plausible reason to explain why I'm wrong. Because I don't mind being wrong. I don't ever have to be right again. So that's how I learn. And I learn from the input from the group that I'm presenting to. So let's walk down this path. And the thesis that I want to lay on you is that when you're looking at uncertain investment environments, there are ways of engineering the risk out. That you can look at an environment where it's very, very uncertain about what the outcome is going to be. And you can kind of say, well, if it has certain properties, or if I can engineer certain properties into that uncertain situation, then even although it remains uncertain, I can take the risk out. Because uncertainty doesn't really matter. What really matters is risk. So if I can go into an uncertain situation, and I can experiment with that uncertain situation in such a way that I'm not putting my resources up to serious risk, then I can afford it. As long as I can fail cheap, it doesn't matter if I fail. It's failing expensively that matters. And so those of you that are interested in entrepreneurial careers, I think it's important to kind of remember that I need to be able to look at situations in such a way that says, I can take the risk out. The uncertainty won't go away, but if I can take the risk out, I can go for it. And most people don't have the courage to do that, or they don't have the imagination to do that. Now, when they came to me when I got my job at Wharton and asked me, how do you make these risky, uncertain investments? I had a problem. And the problem is that I have the creativity of a large mango. In fact, I think a pretty big mango is actually be more creative than me. So I didn't know. And so what I started to do is let me think about people who are able to make successful investment decisions in uncertain situations, and as a result of the way that they think about and approach the problems, they can make money. And I found two groups. The first group is venture capitalists, because they make investments in new enterprises. They put money into new industries sometimes, but people come in with bright new ideas, fraught with uncertainty, and they're able to make pretty good returns. And then the other one, which is kind of perhaps my favorite group, is what we call the habitual entrepreneur. And this is the person that started many new businesses, not just one. This insight was brought to me by a Swedish guy that came to visit me in '87, a year after I joined Wharton. And he said, my brothers and I have started about 30 businesses in the last 10 years. And all of them have made pretty good money for us. Some have failed, but we failed cheap. And he said, I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn how to do better at how do I make these habitual entrepreneur decisions. And I don't even know what an habitual entrepreneur was. There's another name for them called serial entrepreneurs. These are people that, you start many businesses. He said the problem with some entrepreneurs is they make their money and they're very successful and they don't realize that they made their money because they were lucky. And they think they made their money because they were smart. And then when they go and start their second business, they find out that they're not so smart. A second business actually loses all the money that they made in the first business they started. So he said, we've got a way of thinking about approaching these highly uncertain investments that allows us to keep on making money, like 3 businesses a year, every year, for the last 10 years. And I'm here to learn more. So I took the advantage to learn from him. He learned squat from me because I didn't know, but that's okay. He's perfectly happy. And so what I want to try to do is distill some of the stuff that's come out of our looking at these habitual entrepreneurs and these venture capitalists, both of whom can make good money investing in uncertain investments. And I think the sort of core of the problem is epitomized by a thing that all of you know about and love doing, and that's calculating net present values. I know most of you lay awake late last night, really excited at the thought of doing a net present value calculation. Pretty boring stuff. But if you do a net present value calculation, the key thing is what is the implicit assumption that you're making when you do that calculation? Anyone want to take a shot at helping me decide how to do a net present value? Want to shout it out? What do I do to calculate net present value? This is a test of USU. Yeah, I'm just a little old engineer. I don't know what the hell a net present value is. So I go into somebody who's going to provide me with funds, and they sort of say, well, this sounds like a neat idea. What's its net present value? I don't know what to do. Help me. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to project my cash flows over time out to some, period, and then I'm going to take all those cash flows and I'm going to discount them back to the present, and we're going to make the assumption that we actually know what the discount rate is, which is moot. But let's say we put in a fairly plausible discount rate, then I get a value. So then what's the next decision? After I have this net present value. Okay, put my costs in, those are cash outflows, discount them all back, then what? I look at the total, and if it's greater than 0, I invest. If it's less than 0, I sell it to somebody else. Okay? So at least I get a net present value out of that calculation. And so this is the essence of what happened. So let's have a look at a situation here. Now I've got 2 projects, and this project and this project are exactly the same in their cash flows, A and B, And so here I am, as I'm laying out money, and then I launch my business, and then I chug along for a few years, and then along comes competition, and they start eating my lunch, and my profits start to drop, and then eventually it's down to zero. And what I'm interested in is it worth my while to do this? And now what we have is these two possible investments. Investment A, investment A and investment B have exactly the same cash flows. The only difference is that I could stop investment B at X. So I can get to X and then say, whoa, I don't like this. I want to stop. Which investment has more value? This is not a trick question. When I'm making these projections, do I know what the outcome's going to be? If it's an uncertain investment, I don't know. This is my best guess. If I want to be a little bit more sophisticated, I might put in ranges for each one of these values. But basically, the implicit assumption, think about it when I do a net present value calculation, is that the implicit assumption when I do those cash flows and discount them back is that once I start down this path, I'm going to go all the way down that path. Because the fact that I'm discounting back all these values suggests that once I make the investment, I stick with it. Now, you start going down this path and you find out you were wrong. And if you keep on investing in spite of the fact that the news looks bad, can walk. So investment A says I'll make this investment and I'm going to go on doing it irrespective. I'm stuck. I'm trapped in this investment. Investment B has the same cash flow projections, but I can stop if I want to. Which has the greatest value? B, because I have this flexibility. There's a value to the flexibility. Now that to me was the cue. As I went and I started to talk to entrepreneurs and habitual entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and sort of said, how do you look at these investment possibilities? The first thing I said, particularly the venture capitalists, is that when you give me a projection like this and I make this investment in the business, I'm going to do two things. The first thing is I'm going to assume that I can't trust your projections. You're going to be wrong because this is an uncertain investment. You're wrong. Now, given that you're wrong, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be very careful. And in the beginning, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of money, and then what we're going to look at is whether you're really wrong or whether there's some place where you can be right. You can find a way to be right. And then if it looks like you're getting some traction, I'll give you some more money. And then if it looks like you're getting some traction and you're really starting to get a new direction, which, by the way, may be totally different from what we started, but it's still evident that we're going to start getting some cash flows, then I'll give you more money. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep on ramping my investment up in contingent on us beginning to learn what the true result really is. And so that's why we will make investments in projects that we know are wrong. But as long as we can find out early that we're wrong and shut the damn thing down and put the money elsewhere, we can afford it. So this is my big learning from the VCs and also from my interactions with habitual entrepreneurs, because they do the same kinds of things. Is that in the beginning, if you start a business, a successful habitual entrepreneur will say, before I put real money in, before I start making investment in assets, I want to see evidence that I'm going to get revenues from those assets. So one of the projects I was talking about this morning with the faculty was a project that I've been involved in, where we started to make a highly uncertain investment in making a a plant that makes chicken feed in Africa so that local farmers can buy this chicken feed to start farming chickens. And the reason we wanted to do this is that if we can start training people out there to actually grow chickens, then they don't become dependent on, food aid. They can grow their own food and not become totally dependent on the arrival of the food trucks. So this was to us a great idea. We could use University of Pennsylvania technology to calculate low-cost, high-quality feeds and begin to encourage the propagation of chicken farmers. But to do that, you need to have a mixing plant. So your typical non-engineering, risk engineering type thinker would buy a plant, build it, and then find out nobody wants to grow chickens. And the way that this entrepreneur approached it is she said, oh, let's find out if people will buy the feed. So what she did is she laid a concrete floor, and she got a bunch of people from the local communities and paid them to start mixing the feed by hand. And they bagged it by hand. They had shovels, 12 men with shovels and a concrete floor, mixing the feed and putting it into bags. And then they went out to see if they could get people to buy this feed and to see if there was a price at which they could get this feed sold where she could make a profit and they could buy the feed. And once they found that people were buying it, they said, well, maybe what we should do now is go and get a very small second-hand plant. And we'll start making feed in greater quantities with second-hand plant. And then she said, well, now let's get a bigger second-hand plant. Now, most recently, she built a 750-ton-a-month, top-of-the-line Swiss pelletizing plant. But this is 7 years after she started the business. Because what she said is, I'm going to make small investments in the beginning to establish whether, in fact, I should be able to build that plant. And here's the aphorism that we learned from one of the entrepreneurs in Africa. You don't buy equipment unless you have revenues to justify the purchase. You don't buy new equipment unless you can. You don't buy new equipment if you can buy second-hand equipment. You don't buy second-hand equipment if you can lease equipment. You don't lease equipment if you can borrow equipment. You don't borrow equipment if you can beg equipment. And then the last one I'll leave off. You don't beg equipment if you can steal equipment. Because this is a fairly common problem in Africa, as a lot of the stuff gets stolen. But the whole idea is that, you can go into a situation and with modest expenditures establish whether you can afford a much more aggressive investment. But you need to justify it in the beginning. And that's what engineering risk is all about. So, we're not coming up with some little bag of magic fairy dust that you can sprinkle on the problem. It's basically, let's look at the way people make these decisions. And think about a methodology that you might want to follow as you start to build these enterprises. And so the idea here is, can we find ways of intervening in this process and early on test our ideas, and if they appear to be wrong, we can redirect them to where they're more likely to be right. And if they're totally wrong, we can shut them down fast and say, we didn't spend too much money. And that's engineering risk. So the real challenge is, can we sit down and look at an investment situation and find ways of engineering the risk out? By the term that I like to use is, you need to spend your imagination before you spend your money. Now, let's not put money in until we've put all our intellect and all our creativity into saying, can we find ways of increasing the flexibility? And that allows us then to afford to make investments that are not crazy, and we end up regretting it. Okay, so let's have a look at an example. The basic idea is, we're looking at situations now where there's a very low chance of a high upside potential project. So here an eager entrepreneurial team comes to you and they basically say, we can develop this new switching technology that could dramatically increase the rate at which we deliver internet services. You got a budget of $25 for the R&D, and they can develop this new switch. Once we develop the switch, it looks like we're going to, we can install the technology for about $200. Keep it nice and simple. And they're basically saying if we succeed, we open a whole new market. And it'll yield $2,500. But, and here's the rub, there's only a 5% chance that this technology is going to work. So we've got a high upside potential, $2,500, but there's only a 5% chance that this technology they want to develop is going to work. And they're sitting looking at you, asking you, will you write a check? And if you use sort of typical net present value thinking, then typically what you would do is something that looks like this. Okay, my expected discounted cash flow, I'll get this thing right eventually. When I was a kid, I drew in the sand with a stick. Okay, this high-tech stuff is very scary for me. So I've got a 5% chance of my 2,500. That's my revenues that I'm going to generate, and I'm going to spend $225. 25 for this for the R&D, and 200 for the putting the system in place. And this is basically making the assumption as I start down the path, I'm going to continue down that path to the end. And so if you do that in a conventional way of thinking, you end up with a negative $100. But the engineered thinking says, wait a minute, we don't have to do it this way. We can build in flexibility. So how do we build in flexibility? Anyone want to suggest how you might build in flexibility here? To stop if you want to, if the evidence is bad. Sorry? Yeah. Hey, wait a minute. All we need to do is spend 25 to find out whether it works. And if it does work, then we can spend the 200, and then we can go and take, the reward. So what that does is by building in the flexibility, your real life manager, particularly your real life entrepreneur, says, we're going to stage this investment in such a way that we find out whether we're right, and if we're right, then we make the big investment. And what that does is takes a negative 100 and turns it into a positive 90. And this is not rocket science. I mean, this is what managers naturally do. But if you start running around doing NPV calculations and you start projecting spreadsheets and all sorts of other crazy ways of what I call quantifying your fantasy, because that's what a spreadsheet does. It allows you to take all your fantasies and put numbers around them. Then what's going to tend to happen is that you'll come up with that answer rather than that answer. So this idea of engineered investments is not rocket science. And in a way, if you step back and let the managers do it and think about it that's appropriate, they will try to find ways of avoiding this big investment until they've established confidence that they're going to be getting those numbers. And so it gives you the wherewithal to start making much more aggressive investment decisions. Now notice something really important here. That 5% chance has not gone away. We have not taken the uncertainty out of that investment. There's only a 5% chance that this venture will succeed. And people look at this low probability of success and they choke because they can't cope with it. And they don't stop and say, wait a minute, I'm going to kill this damn uncertainty by allowing me to go for the uncertainty, but first I'm going to engineer the risk out. And that's where your true opportunities often lie. And in particular, if you're an entrepreneur, you need to know that using this kind of thinking, which will come fairly intuitively to you, is something that big companies have a hard time doing. Because they run around doing net present value calculations and babble about hurdle rates and stuff like that, instead of looking at what the true structure of that opportunity is all about. But notice the second thing is that if you can't engineer that opportunity out, then what you should be doing is taking this investment decision and persuading your worst enemy to make the investment. So what we started to look at, and you know, there's very little that is novel about this. I told you I have the creativity of a large mango. So the only way that I can kind of get traction in stuff like this is to go and talk to and work with people that are kind of fluent with this kind of thinking and see if we can kind of set up some challenges for people to think about. And so let's have a look at a couple of the other things. Now, in reality, if you start to look at these uncertain investment decisions, you know, you don't usually have these distributions where you have a nice little clean 5%, 95%. You know, oftentimes what you'll have is much more complex outcomes. That means that you might have to have more complex methods for doing the analysis. But it doesn't mean that the principles no longer pertain. And so what I've done here is deliberately constructed a series of relatively simple examples so that people can understand it. I could easily put up a really complex example, and it would take like 3 minutes before all but the brightest people in the room might understand it, and the whole purpose of the presentation would have been destroyed. Because the key thing is for you guys to basically say, hey, I hear this thing, I get it, I think that this is a neat way for me to begin thinking. Let me formalize my informal ways of looking at risks and uncertainty and take that away with me as I go forth, start my businesses, or in the case of you that are already in your businesses, grow your businesses, make huge amounts of money, and then send fat donations to Doug here, who really needs your money. So that's thing. Some of you might want to note down, send money to Doug. Okay, so when you make that ton of money, send it to... Oh, okay. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of other things. You challenge the team to spend their imagination rather than their money. So along comes Mike. He says, well, why do we have to do the R&D ourselves if we can find somebody who's got a better chance of making the breakthrough than us? And instead of us eating the cost, we pay somebody else to do it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of reduce the risk by going to somebody who, instead of a 5% chance, has a 10% chance. But I'm going to have to pay them. The people who are running this specialized technology lab, you know, did not have mothers who had idiot children. They're going to make you pay for this. They says what we can do is instead of spending 25 bucks ourselves, we'll spend 50 bucks with an R&D specialized company, which are starting to be dotted around your communities. If you drive in here, there's a lot of people out there that are doing R&D, and some of them are starting to say, we have these skills, why don't we have other people pay us to deploy these skills? And this, by the way, if you're really skilled at something, is also an entrepreneurial opportunity. And if we do something like that, now the probability is up to 10%. And now, so what I do is instead of getting $90, what I'm going to do is I get $175. So once again, I've engineered out the downside. So that's one question you could ask. Can I buy the information that I'm short? I don't have to do it myself, but if I can find some way of buying information that gets me more conversant with the, with the possibility, I can go do that. And then you can do it in different contexts. We had a technology uncertainty. Let's have a look at a market uncertainty. They could go into the Chinese market. And in this particular case, if we go into the Chinese market, we've got an NPV of about 1,200. If the adoption is rapid, 0 if it's slow. The problem is if we go into this market and it takes a long time for it to get traction, the Chinese will knock us off. You go into a Chinese market, it's not going to take too long before some astute and inspired Chinese come into that market with a knockoff. And they have, at the moment, relatively little compunction about stomping all over your so-called intellectual protection, your IP. And so if your traction is slow, you're going to get your lunch taken away from you. And it's going to cost $50 to put in place the marketing program. and once we've put it in place, it's $200 to put the plant in. Same structure. So whether your uncertainty stems from technology or your uncertainty stems from the market and the market characteristics, you're still facing this problem that I have a very high potential outcome with a low probability of success. And here's the trouble, is that if you don't go into these kinds of opportunities, and if you don't start down that road, you'll never get down the end of the road. So you're walking away from great opportunities because you're being kind of intimidated by the uncertainty. And I would submit to you that the entrepreneurs, habitual entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists have basically beaten that. The second thing is that if you can come up with a way of taking you come up with an entrepreneurial idea, you don't have to pursue that idea. You are still young. So if it has the wrong properties, don't do it. Get some company to pay you to take down a salary while you think of the next idea. So don't just feel obsessed about going after the first idea that comes along. Look at it and say, can I engineer out the risk? And if I can, I'll give it a shot. But if I can't do it, I'll put it in inventory as an idea for the future and chug along there taking down a salary while I wait for the next one to come along. So with that, what you can do is take a project that's worth 190 and you show that to anybody, negative 190, and they're going to run like a roach in the light. And you say, well, what I can do is I can take this investment and I can bring it down to break even by using this kind of approach. But I've still got a break even. And break even is not exciting because what I need to be doing with my money is getting, adding wealth to either my company if I'm an employee or to my own pocketbook if I happen to be an entrepreneur. So this is not one you're going to go for unless you can process it further. And she says that even if we get pirated with this particular project, she's found a Chinese firm we could sell the plant to for $100. So I built my plant for 200. I get pirated. I can go to one of the pirates and I can say, hey, don't you want to buy my plant? Now we don't want this to happen. You don't get on your knees at night and say, please let this happen. But if this happens, then you have this opportunity. So one of the things you can begin to think about is that if we go into this thing, is there a way in which we can create what we call abandonment value? Now notice I use terms like abandonment because I'm from University of Pennsylvania, and that's an Ivy League school. And they have to have fancy long words. So we use polysyllabic words like abandonment. But the basic idea is if we go into this thing, is there a way for us to get some cash out of it again? So another challenge you could give to yourself if you're an entrepreneur, or to the people in your business development team if you happen to be a manager in a company, is say, guys, what are the different ways in which we can create abandonment value? If we go in, if the downside happens, is there still a way in which we can back out of the problem and benefit from the problem? Because that allows me to go in. So notice here the objective is not to have to abandon. But the fact that you can abandon adds to the value of the project. But also recognize that if you can calculate an abandonment value, then you're not going to get the full abandonment value counting towards the value of your project. You have to take into account the fact that you've got to try not to let it happen. And so what happens to the calculation then is that we'll go from, we'll be able to calculate the 5%, there's a 5% chance of the 100 if we get knocked off, and that takes a 0 to a $10. Okay. Joan, This is a real case, by the way. I've just kind of done two things. One is I've simplified it, and the second is that I've not named the company, because a commitment that I make to any company that I work with is that I won't release the name of the company, but I will release the results. So what we've done is we've played around with the results to make it simpler. But this is a real company, in fact, making a real decision to go into China. And Joan was she was a pistol, this lass. She just basically kept on coming. Once she got the bit between her teeth, you couldn't stop her. This is somebody that really deeply understood how do you take the, engineer the risk out of the investment. She says, well, why don't we go to the legal cost, to the lawyers? Now, you can't go near a lawyer without having to pay some money. So we'll pay them $15, and what we'll do here is we'll sell the manufacturing rights to US and European firms who are operating in China and license them to manufacture and use the product. So I don't even have to take the plant risk anymore, and I can still make money out of China. Which basically means I don't have to make any of that product. I found a way of generating net present value out of a situation without putting that major investment into the first place. And so, oftentimes, you might want to ask yourself, do we really have to go and put a plant in? Do we really have to go and build a factory? Do we have to create an office, or whatever the case may be? Is there some way of finessing it so that, the found money starts flowing towards me? Because the real idea is that you want to find found money. And so that's that was the next step she took in the process. And now what we're doing is we're taking this initial investment that was but worth about $5, and we turned it into a $40 win without taking the risk at all. So we're still playing this uncertain environment, but we're not taking risk anymore. And one of the key things that we started to argue about in the company is that if you have people in the company that think like this, how can you reward them for being this smart? And to me, what I need to do is sort of say, okay, Joan, you saved us, $35, you've gained us $35, that counts towards your bonus. So there's a real incentive to start thinking like this. And this is one of the things that we're starting to address now. So this is kind of what we do as we sit down and look at an uncertain investment. We'll challenge a team, the entrepreneur and some of their key friends who have expertise and so on, to start asking questions like, is there ways in which we can buy information? Can we contract with somebody to reduce the risk for us? That they do it better than us, so let's pay them. Why do we try and do it ourselves? Can we postpone investment? Now think about the situation that we're facing today with many healthcare-related companies, and the kind of chaos that's going on as Washington grinds around with things like the healthcare program in the country. Maybe what we do is we wait until the dust is settled, until the politicians have sorted things out. And if it's not going to cause us to fall behind our competitors, let's wait, because there's a value in having the flexibility of waiting. Another thing you might say is, can we stage the investment? If I can get optimal production at a plant that's 100 tons a day, do I have to build a 100-ton-a-day plant, or can I build a 10-ton-a-day plant, use that 10-ton-a-day plant, which I build at much, much lower cost, in order to find out whether it's worth building another 95-ton-a-day plant? So are there ways in which we can stage the investment and learn our way to what the optimal capacity needs to be, instead of assuming it and then overbuilding? Can I create call opportunities? Can I do market tests? A market test gives you the right but not the obligation to invest further. I do my market test. If it looks good, I invest further. If it doesn't, I stop. So that's like that's a call. I'm buying the right but not the obligation to invest further. Can I create abandonment value? One of the examples is, instead of building a specialized plant, can we build a plant, the first production line, out of generalized assets? Because if my assets are generalized, if I've got generalized production, then I can, and things go wrong, I can sell it off for much more than buying a specialized plant and that specialized plant is now on the market, and there's not too many buyers. And then can I create puts? If we're disappointed, can we find somebody else to pick up the tab? Maybe we can sit down and talk to in one of the projects we did with a company called Air Products, which I'm allowed to use, they've given me permission, as we said, if we can't get regulatory approval in the United States, we found people in Mexico who don't have the regulatory problems that we have, that will be willing to pursue the project. And so we can put our disappointment to somebody else. They'll pick up the slack. And the neat thing about this is, particularly when you're working with younger people, is that they totally can't do. So, give them a chance to look at this thing and come up with kind of, in a structured way, with, sort of weird ideas about how we might do these things. And you'd be surprised that, firstly, how much value they get out of it, but secondly, and more importantly, how much value you're going to get out of being able to mobilize that intellect and that creativity that is as yet unencumbered by experience. And I very aggressively use this at Wharton. We have very, very smart kids come to Wharton, undergrads. They're just like the undergrads here, very smart. And they know there's some things, they don't know there's some things that you can't do. So I'll give you a specific example. We were working with DuPont, and DuPont have given me permission to use this example. They were bemoaning the fact that they generate thousands of patents a year. They spend huge amounts of money on technology and patenting. And about 0.5% of those patents ever see commercial value. So you have all this money spent into developing new technologies and new patents, and only a very, very small percentage of all those patents end up with commercial value. Some of them end up having commercial value years later. They only discover what the killer application was years later. And they basically said, this is a tragedy. There's not a way in which we can find those killer applications and find them sooner. So I got a bunch of my undergraduates in and I said, I need you guys to develop an algorithm for me that allows you to go into document bases, not databases, document bases, and hunt around in those document bases which we've assembled and see if you can find an application for this new technology that nobody ever thought of. So an example, carbon reinforced fiberglass. This wasn't a DuPont product, but it was developed specifically to provide you with housings for satellites. Because what you want to house a satellite is something that protects the satellite from meteorites that are flying around in space. And the problem with putting weight in space is it's very expensive. So what you want is something that's very high impact resistance and very light. And someone came up with the idea, let's take fiberglass and reinforce it with carbon fibers. So they came up with this concept of, housing these satellites. It took 15 years for them to find out that the real application for carbon reinforced fiberglass was not in the sky, but on the ground. Where do you see a lot of carbon reinforced fiberglass? Golf clubs, tennis rackets, baseball bats, hockey sticks, bowling balls, bicycle frames. 15 years of lost, discounted cash flow. And I have this vision that the guys that are developing this, they're specialists. And the trouble with specialists is they have deep, narrow vision. That's how you become a specialist. So here this guy is, and she's developing this carbon reinforced fiberglass, and she's looking at this stuff while she's swinging her tennis racket, thinking about an upcoming tennis game. And she can't make a connection between the qualities that are needed to make this fiberglass and the use of the tennis racket. And it's not because she's stupid. It's because that's the nature of specialists. So all that money of that killer application, that hundreds of millions of dollars, you had to wait 15 years and discount it for 15 years to see the value. So we said to the students, in effect, go out and help us develop some algorithms that will allow us to systematically search for something we don't know is there. You know? Now, any sort of mature manager will say, "Are you nuts? Yeah? You're asking me to do the impossible." So I asked my undergrads. We're now just getting our third patent for this particular approach. Because they went out, and they didn't know you couldn't do it, so they did it. They found a way. And so, to me, one of the key things and the key opportunities here is, go and get people who really don't necessarily know a hell of a lot about this investment, but have a lot of creativity, and say, go with it. And give them these questions to start to ask, and don't be too terrified if they come up with stuff you never dreamed of. And recognize that quite a lot of the stuff is going to be, well, that's great. Where did you buy your funny stuff to smoke? But this is where the ideas start to come from that allow you to come in and sort of systematically hack out the risk from something that inherently remains uncertain. But now I can afford it. I can afford to go for the gold. And that's the basic philosophy. And if they can do it, here's the number to call. If you ask the people who simply cannot come up with ideas about how to engineer the risk out, this is the number for the limo company, Boston Coach. And what you do is you call up Boston Coach and you load all those people into Boston Coach and have them delivered to your competitor's doorstep. And let them contaminate the competitor's gene pool and not yours. Because what you're saying to your people is that if you want me to invest in an uncertain investment, spend your imagination before my money. Come to me with the ways of taking out the risk. And I don't care how uncertain it is. Just get the risk out. Make it possible to fail cheap, fail fast. And if you do, move on. And if you don't, you've made a killing. And now you've got the gold. And I think it's just any time I'm sitting with entrepreneurs that have this harebrained scheme about, doing things that they never, other people wouldn't dream of. I say, first I want to see you spending your energy and effort on this before you even see a nickel of my money. So that's the basic idea. And then the planning process that we use is something that evolved on my first publication in this area. Was with a woman called Rita McGrath at Columbia University, and it's called Discovery-Driven Planning. And what it basically says is that if I'm going to do something that's uncertain, I need to set a profit target and a profitability target that make it worth even contemplating taking that risk. Specify what do we physically have to do in order for this to happen. So I'm going to start asking, if you want to have this, let's say it's a product, if you want this number of sales, in units of sales, how many salespeople have to make how many sales calls with what kind of a hit rate for you to get the orders. Once we have the orders, how many trucks have to ship how many deliveries in order for the customer to receive the orders. And then how are we going to get the customer to recognize that they now owe you money and they're going to have to pay you? Because the fact that you have an order doesn't mean that you've got cash flow in. So what are all the physical things that have to happen for this quantified fantasy called your spreadsheet to actually occur? And then begin to think about, where am I making assumptions? Because my challenge is, can I convert assumptions to knowledge ahead of investment? Can I come up with checkpoints where I can test my assumptions, and as I become more and more confident in these assumptions, I'm going to be able to convert them into knowledge, and I'll do that at key checkpoints I've identified. And at each checkpoint I can ask, given the information I have now, shall I continue or do I need to redirect? And if I can't redirect into some new opportunity, then what I might do is just write it off and move on. And take my talent, which is the scarcest resource, and my money elsewhere and put it into a more worthwhile resource. And this is covered in, 5 or 6 different articles. Put in discovery-driven planning and it'll pop up there. And if you read this stuff, you'll be real sorry. This is not exciting stuff. So what I thought is that might be enough to have you cogitate a little bit and see if there are any questions you might have about what we've been talking about.
So you'll take some questions?
Sure. If you don't ask me a question, my mommy will cry. Yes, sir.
On your first example of the net present value,
Yes.
you talked about only investing $25 instead of the $225.
Yeah.
But you still had the same revenue that you would get from that.
Yeah.
How is that possible? Because to me it seems as though you need to do research and development and the production in order to get that future revenue stream.
Well, remember what I did is I cheated. Okay? And I basically said, let me go back to it. If you're dumb enough to ask me a question, by golly, you're going to have a look at these numbers. What I basically said here is that if we do this, then what we're going to do is we're going to get a discounted, whoops, see, I still haven't learned this thing. We're going to get a discounted cash flow of $2,500. This includes all your costing of, of the product and the cash flows, and I'm just basically saying, let's pretend we've got all this stuff, and we take it and we calculate a discounted cash flow. So it's not that you haven't taken into account the costs, but it's that the whole schmear, if we go forward with this thing, if the product is developed successfully and we build a plant, your reward is that discounted cash flow. So you would still, in a real life situation, you'd have all those nice little projections and that I had in this chart over here. But what we're basically saying is that at this point in time, thinking about going forward, I've got some investment. I've got about 25 investment to find out if the market will bite, and then I've got a $200 investment in the plant, and then I launch, and all the cash flows come, and I've discounted them. Others? There are two books, by the way, that you might be interested in. We can make sure you get it, so you don't have to frantically write it down. If you order the books, let Doug's people know, because I'll take the royalties from those books that I get from this recommendation, because I wrote both of them, and I'll donate them to the disabled American veterans. So I'm not going to benefit from this recommendation. The first one is a book with McGrath called The Entrepreneurial Mindset that discusses this in a lot more detail than I've been able to give you here. It's great when you have insomnia, read it and your insomnia is solved. And then the more technical book is with a guy called Alex Van Putten, who has a look at how do you actually assess the option value of these kind of investments, because you can actually calculate what the option value is of an investment of this nature. And in the old days, what you needed was a few people with degrees, advanced degrees in mathematics to do the calculation. That's all been reduced to software now. So what you do is you put in the key variables, and it'll calculate what the value is. Like today, I don't know if anybody calculates net present value by doing, C1 over 1 plus R to the 1, or C2 over 1 plus R to the 2. What you do is you put it into your calculator, and it gives you the answer. You put in NPV, and it calculates the results. We are not here to do math. Computers do math for you. You're here to think about, can I ask questions that will make this math magical for me? So the intellectual effort should be in answering these questions and coming up with ways of making your investment more flexible. And the solution to the complex algorithms and complex formulae that go into that calculation, that's done by computers. And the nice thing about computers is they do it fast, and even if they don't do it fast, they never have to go to the John, and they never have to go to sleep. So you can go and have a cup of coffee while it's doing the calculations for you. But that's done today. That problem's licked. There's a guy called Adrian Becker, who was one of my undergrads at Penn, who worked with me, and he's just recently getting his PhD at MIT for specifically the algorithms that allow you to do real options valuations. So the mindless mathematical stuff is done now by the computer.
The title of the second book.
opportunity engineering. Not surprisingly. We got to slip engineering into the title somehow. Any others? Yes, sir.
You were talking a lot about failing fast, and it's okay to be wrong. Those seem like tough values to take on if they're not already instilled in you. Is that something that you only see in certain people, or is that something you can learn?
I think, you know, people like the habitual entrepreneurs and the VCs, they see that. I mean, the VCs, what they do is they're ruthless. They'll sit down with you and say, look, I'll give you $5,000 to do a market study. You come back to me with it, and if that market study looks good, I'll give you $10,000 to develop a model. And if that model looks like it's working, I'll give you $100,000 to do a pilot plan. They are ruthless. Because the key thing about capturing this value is you need to be willing to shut it down if it's not working. And that's where the big cost is where people stupidly keep on going to put money into something that's going nowhere because they hope it will work. So what you have to be is very clear about what are the objectives that we're going to test at this checkpoint, and we're going to do it, by golly, at that checkpoint. And if it doesn't look good, you are dead, baby. You know, I'll put flowers on your grave, but you're dead. And that allows you to go out there because it hasn't cost you a lot yet. You can afford a lot of failure if your failure cost is low. But what happens is people go for high cost of failure. You know, stupid failure as opposed to intelligent failure. And that's what starts to become a mess. And the trouble is that it's the big companies that are most prone to doing that. When am I supposed to shut up? I'm never...
One or two more questions.
Okay. Yes, sir. Oh, you answered my NPV question. Absolutely. I'll remember you to my grave. Thank you.
The question I had, I remember you mentioned first that you buy used equipment if you can.
Yeah.
You get used equipment before you get new, right?
Yeah.
And then you got down to what was the one before you steal it?
Big.
Bag.
Yeah. Now, just think about this, guys. Really think about this. A lot of companies out there today are suffering. They're hurting. Which basically means there's a lot of unused productive capacity. And there's productive capacity in terms of equipment that's standing idle. And there's a productive capacity in terms of which people are trying to keep employees because they want to be nice to their employees and keeping them, even although the employees are underemployed. That is capacity that you as an entrepreneur can sweep into if you're persuasive and say, let me use it. And if I win, I'll give you a tiny piece of the action. Let me onto your plant at night and let me use your plant. You know, let me get a couple of the people that are really, in a way, sitting idle in the company and mobilize them to help me do some programming. And so there's lots of capacity there, which has, to me, the dual purpose, the purpose that you're able to get it inexpensively, and at the same time, you know, you're creating value for those companies. So, I mean, this is a case of not wasting resources that are just lying fallow now. And you don't have to go and buy that plant until you have revenues to justify buying the plant.
Mac, Mike has an example of what you're talking about.
Great.
So I've asked him to come up and share that. This is on the question of beg for resources. So that you don't
You've
have
got
to
a strong word. Oh, you got that. Okay.
Thank you, Mac. It was great. I really enjoyed listening to you. I was thinking as he was talking that we've been interviewing entrepreneurs now for almost 20 years and collecting oral histories. And I find that the successful entrepreneurs that create new companies, they do exactly what you're talking about almost by default because they don't have any funding.
No.
So they cobble together a whole bunch of resources and create low-cost prototypes, and then they test those. And if they work, then they pursue them, and if they don't, they abandon them. And so entrepreneurs just do that naturally because they have to do that. And then later, as corporations grow, every corporation is started by an entrepreneur, but as they grow, then we become much less efficient. We spend a lot more money doing things. Entrepreneurs do things for less money. So if we can bring those entrepreneurial attitudes on funding new products and funding new services into large corporations, we can be much more efficient. But the example that Doug asked me to tell you, this is very typical of what we've seen. People always say to me, yeah, that's great, Glauser, but what about a real capital-intensive industry where you have to spend a lot of money on expensive equipment and resources? And the story I like to tell is the founder of Celebrity Helicopters. His name is Robin Petgrave from Jamaica, and I talked a little bit about him in my presentation yesterday. But he had no money, and it cost $250,000 to buy a helicopter, so he found people. If you were here yesterday, I briefly mentioned he found people that had helicopters, and he created agreements with them to rent those by the hour. And then he went out and sold an hour of flight training, and he didn't have to pay a penny until he sold the hour. Then he went and paid to lease the helicopter. So he was able to eventually buy 30-plus helicopters with cash flow in a very, very capital-intensive industry by just getting really innovative about how he would make it work. So,
thank you, Mike. And
Thank you.
I think this is an appropriate time for us to thank Matt for his work today. We appreciate it so much. We actually have a little gift here, Mac, that we want you to take back to Wharton with you. It's got a little dish for your desk. It says John M. Huntsman School of Business on it. So we hope you'll enjoy it. And thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. And now, Jamie, we'll turn the time back to you.
Thank you. Do you have any remarks you want to do? You do? Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. We have 2 more drawings we're going to give away, and then we have ice cream in the lobby. So turn in your